Hi, everyone, and welcome to IntimaSEE. I'm your host, Austin. I'm joined today with my co-host, Dr. Mary Stedman. And today we are shining a light on Grace Blakeley, the author of Vulture Capitalism. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's so great to be here.
What inspired you to write the book Vulture Capitalism?
So, I think the main thing that inspired me to write the book was seeing these trends in politics where people are feeling really powerless. And often that's motivating them to react in quite negative ways, quite with anger or with apathy or with resentment. And I wanted to kind of understand the root causes of that sense of powerlessness and the reactions that it's causing in our politics. So I really wanted to look at how capitalist economies kind of tend to make us feel powerless. And that was the starting point for the book. It was really about looking into whether or not capitalist economies are really free market systems, like we're told. We have this idea that when you live under capitalism, it means you're free. You can free to choose whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. You can go wherever you want, vote for whoever you want for. And yet, the reality of these systems is actually one in which your life is very, very constrained. And you're told that you're free, but actually, your choices aren't as free as you would like to think. And I think that creates a real sense of tension in people's minds. There's this idea that, okay, we live in free markets. I should be able
Right,
to achieve, the American dream, do whatever I
right.
want. And yet, actually, a lot of the time, those systems are rigged against the people at the bottom. So big corporations get loads of help from the government. They kind of cooperate with each other. They often like have monopoly power. And yet when it's workers, they don't get very much support, and they're forced to really compete just in order to get by. So the reality of capitalism is kind of like free markets for some, and then kind of lots of protection for others.
You give almost an historical analogy in your book when you mention lords and their servants, or for excuse me, for a lack of a better word, almost like a close to a peasant working the
Yeah.
land with the hopes and promises of, some wages and or some type of protection. Are you drawing that? Is it a fair assessment to say that that's an analogy of what we're living in today in
So
capitalism, or?
Well, yeah, when I was looking at feudalism and talking about feudalism, which is the kind of system that preceded capitalism in and around Europe, the US is different because, of course, we already had capitalism and then people left and went to go kind of set it up again in the US. But in the UK, we had this system of kings and lords who owned lots of land and then peasants who kind of worked on that land, and had to basically do lots of agricultural labor, and then a certain amount of the stuff that they produced went to the lords, and that was the relationships upon which society was based. Now, the reason that I talk about that isn't necessarily to say that's the same as the system that we're in now, because I think there are a lot of important differences. The reason I talk about it is because if you were to ask those peasants or the lords or anyone really living in that system whether or not they could have imagined a different kind of world, they would probably have said no. They would have been like, this is the natural order of things. This is what, the religious institutions tell us is the right way to organize a society. They would have said, the peasants couldn't possibly be given the right to vote or, be freed from their bondage to these landowners because they wouldn't know what to do. They're not intelligent enough. They don't have the capacity to organize themselves. Equally, people would have said it's fair that this system works the way it does because the people at the top kind of have like a divine right to rule everyone else. So there are all these kind of ideologies and narratives that were used to prop up this system that made people believe that it was fair and right and unchangeable. And I think we have that same issue in the system that we live in now. People will say it's impossible to imagine anything other than kind of really free market capitalism, basically. And it's impossible to think that, citizens can come together and decide how their local government works, or that workers can come together and build cooperatives and different ways of organizing the economy. Because we say people are too individualistic, they're too competitive, they can't cooperate with each other. And actually, I think that that's just an ideology that's used to legitimize and justify this system that's really unfair. and convince us that it can't be changed when it can.
You know, it's when you're a truth teller and you're exposing a very sobering reality for everyone, there are going to be people who I can imagine will speak out against you for that. Did you face any of that?
Yeah, a lot. A lot. Yeah, I've had a really interesting journey when it comes to like my own role in the spotlight, I guess, and my own role as an author and a thinker and someone who appears in the media quite a lot. Because I think when I started doing this kind of work, I was maybe like 24, 25. I was pretty young. And it kind of exploded very quickly. And I think social media particularly can do that. You start talking about the issues that you care about, you start getting picked up, and then suddenly, as soon as people are saying, oh, you're doing a really good job, there's loads of people who are then going to say, oh, you're terrible, I completely disagree with everything that you're saying. And I think when I first started, I got really caught up in that and really like attached my sense of who I am and my identity to what was going on in, on social media and how people were talking about me. And it was really hard because for every positive comment you get at least one negative comment, and your brain, hooks on to the negative comment much more than it does the positive comments. Um, so I think, it took a lot of different things, and I'm happy to talk about them, to kind of shake me out of that way of being. And now I think I've got a bit more of a healthy understanding of what it means to be in a position like I am, which is like, it's not to do with me and my ego and what people say about me. It's really about, having a message, going out there and trying to spread it in the most effective way possible.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're recommending people do to try to make a change?
Yeah, I think the big thing for me is really fighting back against individualism. I think this is one of the big things that makes us feel really powerless because, we live in these capitalist economies where there's lots of power concentrated at the very top. That's true. But it's still possible to resist that and to build different models and different spaces, different kinds of, mini worlds almost. And I look in the book at lots of examples throughout history of communities that have come together and said we're going to decide how our local government is spending its money, through to workers who have been able to take over the businesses in which they're working and have done so really effectively. All of these examples are basically about people kind of taking power and democratizing the economy and society. So for me, the biggest barrier that stops us all from doing that, whether that's, stopping us from getting involved in politics or stopping us from, I don't know, doing something like joining a union or getting involved in a social movement, it is this sense that I'm only responsible for me. That, the only thing that matters is what I'm achieving, how I'm doing, where I am in the kind of social hierarchy. And I don't really have responsibility for other people. Other people don't have responsibility for me. And that's a natural way of being as a person. That's the idea. Actually, it's a really unnatural way of being as a person. For most of human history, we've lived in groups where we've all been very interdependent. We've all worked very closely to survive and to thrive. So this kind of really hyper individualistic world that we have today is quite unnatural over the course of history. And I don't think it's very good for us. It's making us feel isolated and, scared at each other. I think it's, responsible for a lot of our mental health, a lot of anxiety among young people. It's like people comparing themselves to each other and thinking, where do I sit in this social pecking order? Rather than having this much more kind of open and expansive way of looking at your community and your society, which is to say, we are responsible for ourselves, that is true, but we're also responsible for each other. We're interdependent. So what I do affects other people. And equally, what they do affects me. And if I want to change things and I want to build a better world, I can't just push everyone else out the way and try to get to the top and insulate myself from what's going on in the rest of society. I have to join with other people and start trying to build change from the ground up. And so in the book, I look at lots of different ways, as I've said, that people have done that throughout history. And there's so many opportunities that are happening all around the world today as well for people to get involved in, whether that is, getting involved in electoral politics and joining a political party and pushing for change there, or whether it's getting involved in a community organization, local cooperatives, or, joining like a climate movement or whatever. Anything that brings you together with other people to fight for change is really, going to make the world better.
It sounds like you're talking a little bit about the difference between selfishness and selflessness. What, how could we as a society encourage people to be more selfless and loving toward one another?
I think that's a
That's a great question.
really interesting question. Yeah. And it does kind of cut to the core of what I'm talking about, because I think one of the big problems is that we're taught to believe that we're all selfish. And if you come forward and say, actually, no, it doesn't feel good to be selfish, or people are just as likely to support each other and help each other as they are to cut each other down. People say, oh, you're naive. You don't understand human nature. That's not right. And actually, there's a lot of really interesting research that I've come across writing this book, which suggests that people have very, very deep cooperative, nurturing impulses. And when they are unable to realize those, it really damages their mental health. For example, if you're living in a close-knit community and everyone around you is suffering, you will take on that suffering. For as long as you are
Hmm.
connected to those people, you will feel
Hmm.
their suffering. And there's almost a kind of trend in our society that encourages us to deny that, to push that down, to say, oh, that's weak, or that's naive, or that's not the way that people really work. But it is the way that people really work. When we
That's
see
true.
images of war and conflict and inequality, it hurts us. And I think we need to nurture that rather than trying to push it down, nurture that empathy, nurture those inherent parts of what it means to be a human.
And you're really, it sounds like you're really investigating and researching the darker corridors of human experience to be able to see that light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, to point out what and where we need to improve on within
Mm.
ourselves and with as a collective. Who
Yeah,
who ho- who really inspired you? Where does that inspiration come from? What was the crossroad moment that you had in your walk in life that you said, "Oh, that's where I need to like go. That's where I need to study," right?
yeah. I think a lot of it goes back to my family background, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So my grandparents on my mum's side were basically very politically active, kind of on the left as well. So my grandfather was a trade unionist, and had a pretty like difficult childhood, and eventually met my grandmother and became quite active in political organizing and union organizing. And he was a very intelligent man who had basically educated himself about capitalism, about the way that society works. And my grandma was the same. They were both very fierce, independent, intelligent, and they raised my mum, who was the first in her family to go to university, ended up going to Cambridge and learning all about all of this stuff even more and maintaining those values. There she met my dad, and they traveled all around the world. They spent some time in Nicaragua, for example, when all of the kind of political unrest was taking place there. But also time around kind of South and Central America, and that experience, I think, kind of bolstered their political activism as well. And I was just raised in this environment where it was unquestioned that the world was unfair, that there were people with power who used that power to kind of oppress and exploit everyone else, but that it didn't have to be that way. And that, there was always hope to try and create a different kind of world. There was always hope that people could kind of come together with those around them to change things. And yeah, I think, that was something that I really took in. I remember when I was really young talking to my granddad, and he was talking to me about the way the system works and stuff. And I said to him, like, why can't the government just take everyone's money in at the end of the year and then give it back out to them so that everyone has the same amount and we can start over again? That was my great idea for fixing inequality. But it was just like, that was the kinds of conversations that we were having. It was like, how can we make the world fairer? And I think that's kind of the question I've been asking ever since.
And so it sounds like your home environment really influenced you to be open-minded and open to other cultures. Is that what, um, is that, are those roots of your home what opened you to studying African, um, the economic market in Africa and African countries? I think you did your thesis, right?
Yeah.
And that, could you explain more about that?
Yeah, so I studied politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford. And as part of that, I decided to really delve deep into studying African politics. I was really interested, these questions around how do we make the world fairer, I think made me become very interested in global inequality, the kind of unfairness that means that some people are so poor, living in the context of conflict, of a lack of resources, whilst others are so wealthy. And I got very interested in questions around global development and that sort of thing. And I started studying African politics and eventually traveled to the Democratic Republic of Congo, to which I was writing my thesis basically about the conflict in the DRC. And that was a very complex conflict that related to the legacy of colonialism, interethnic conflicts that had gone back a very long time, but also to the dynamics of global capitalism, because the Congo is a very poor country, but is home to some extraordinarily valuable resources. And historically, those resources have been exploited both by kind of international governments and corporations, but also by rebel groups seeking to fund a conflict and kind of enrich themselves. And they've been supported in doing that by international financial institutions, by kind of governments in the area. And that network of basically kind of greed and corruption has sustained a conflict that's still going on today in the DRC, that's killed millions of people and created a horrendous humanitarian crisis. So when I traveled there, during my undergraduate years, I think I was about 19 or 20, that reality was made very, very clear to me and very, very stark. And it was at that point that I thought that is what I wanted to carry on doing, that I wanted to carry on studying African politics. Interestingly enough, I then went on to do a master's in African studies. And it was after studying African studies that I realized actually a lot of the factors that keep these countries poor have to do with the way we organize our economies. So I became really shocked at things like the way that British banks and financial institutions facilitate tax avoidance and corruption and fraud and money laundering on behalf of kind of elites within some of the poorest countries in the world. And just the way that, big dominant corporations in rich countries are able to kind of exploit and oppress those poorer countries, and often the way that they're supported by our governments as well. So that kind of is what actually led me away from studying Africa itself and towards studying global capitalism, basically, and how it retains these big inequalities of power.
That's very fascinating. And I feel like so many people here in the United States have a lot to learn from you and your travels too, is to um, expose themselves to unfamiliar surroundings and unfamiliar environments, because somehow it's all globally connected to the way United States operates as well, most of the Western countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually just got back from spending some time traveling through Central America and South America. And, the legacy of the violence that has often been inflicted by the US and other countries in that part of the world is very, very clear. I was in El Salvador for a while, which until recently was, in this very, very horrible civil war. What then happened after the Civil War was that a bunch of people involved in it were kind of deported. Left the country during the war to go to the US and ended up in places like LA, where they formed these gangs. And then towards the end of the 1990s, those gangs were all deported back to El Salvador, having grown and developed and built up networks in the US. And they started wreaking havoc on the population there, just unimaginable levels of violence. And there was no support. There was no kind of support from the US to say, oh yeah, this is a problem that is both of ours. Obviously, these gangs are often involved in illegal drugs as well, which creates problems for the US. And El Salvador was just left to deal with it on its own. And now it has a extremely authoritarian strongman president who's come to power, basically saying, I'm going to deal with the gang problem, but at a really significant human cost as well. And you see this story repeated throughout lots of different countries. In Nicaragua, famously, when you had the Iran-Contra affair and the involvement of the US in Nicaraguan politics, in Chile, in Guatemala, and all these different places. And what's often happened is that big, powerful governments like those of the US, and the UK is very guilty of this as well, intervene in smaller countries to basically prop up their own interests, and often the interests of their corporations as well. There's a very interesting history of the US government basically forcing governments in Central and South America to give preferential treatment to American corporations in those countries, and just to kind of ignoring the fate of the people there. And I don't think that is necessarily always a big part of the conversation in the US or indeed in the UK when we're talking about things like migration. What's forced all these people out of their countries in the first place? Well, it's often a legacy of poverty and conflict that has been aided and abetted by our governments.
I'm thinking of two countries that seem to be dealing with that in different ways. One is Venezuela. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that's different. And the other is Costa Rica, which seems to be not having as many problems as some of the other ones. I wonder what's different in those two countries.
Yeah, sure. Well, in Costa Rica, it's got an interesting history. It has had a lot of European immigration. So if you go to Costa Rica, there's lots of actually kind of German people who've been living there for a very, very long time. And it basically was able to build certain kinds of alliances. It had governments that were able to build certain kind of alliances that meant that it kind of didn't have the same types of governments that had been elected in these other countries. And a lot of other countries, like Nicaragua, for example, or Guatemala, it was very poor people who elected quite left-wing governments. And that was what caused the intervention from the US. It was, them saying, oh, we don't want you to have this left-wing government. So that was less of a problem in Costa Rica. In Venezuela, it was obviously a massive problem because, you had this left-wing government, and then the US attempted to remove the leader in an attempted coup. And then after that, when ultimately this regime was able to survive thanks to very high oil prices, but eventually the US imposed really big sanctions on Venezuela, and the oil price started to fall. Not that long ago, and what that created was just kind of economic chaos. So now you've seen with Venezuela an astonishing number of migrants leaving Venezuela, and not actually just arriving in the US, but going to Colombia, to Ecuador, to other parts of South America. And there just being this massive issue of refugees, basically unable to find a safe place to live. Now, there's lots of internal problems within Venezuela that have led up to that, obviously. But the US sanctions have been a really, really big part of that as well. It has kind of contributed to creating this catastrophe in South America.
So getting back to a collective or getting the population to make some difference, any ideas as to how these countries could start to initiate that so that things could change for them?
Yeah, there's actually, I use a lot of examples from poorer countries in my book because they often have a much kind of longer tradition or deeper tradition of mutual support and care. And they haven't been as exposed to the kind of competitive individualism that we have in rich countries. So often, if you live in a very poor country, you have to rely on your community. You have to rely on the people around you to support you because that's the only option that you have. And those community networks have often been really important in building up wider political networks. So this is true in Bolivia, for example, where you have historically had, a very large indigenous community that's been ruled over by a kind of non-indigenous Hispanic-esque elite until the indigenous people started to organize and then say, no, we actually want an indigenous president, someone who's going to redistribute wealth, someone who's going to kind of support our aims. And they did that by organizing themselves as indigenous groups. You see this as well in Brazil, really interesting examples of there are lots of communities, indigenous communities that still live in the Amazon, and their lives and rights have been threatened by things like illegal logging. This was really encouraged by President Bolsonaro, the kind of right-wing president who was in power before Lula in Brazil. And he basically encouraged private companies to go out and just log the Amazon, which obviously creates devastation for local communities, but also exacerbates global warming. And these indigenous communities came together and they just resisted this tooth and nail. And they said, you cannot continue to do this. They made alliances with international NGOs and ultimately fought really, really hard to get Bolsonaro out of power, which is what happened in the end. So I think, when you have these communities that are so closely linked to one another and often really closely linked to nature as well, in a way that we are often not in the rich world, there's a lot of learning that can be done as to how you can organize more effectively. And there are also, I've put in the book a number of examples of this kind of organizing that takes place in the US and the UK as well. One of my favorite ones actually is this example of Cooperation Jackson, which is in Jackson, Mississippi. And it's a group of activists, mainly African American, who've come together and said, we want to build a different kind of community. We want to create jobs for local people. We want to make sure that we have a voice in the government into how public services are being run. And so they organized this kind of community institution called Corporation Jackson, and it just created lots of cooperative businesses. So kind of community-owned and worker-owned businesses that gave jobs to local people, that kind of enriched the community, that provided cheap sources of food for people living in poverty. And it was really like a fantastic example of what communities can do when they come together and say, actually, we want to look after each other. We don't just want to
Right.
compete.
Because it's because you do mention you know, like you give a lot of insight into how much power we have as a collective. When we collectively get together and help each other, we all prosper. And that kind of parallels on the flip side of the coin of this free market smokescreen that you talk about. What does that look like, this free market smokescreen?
Yeah, so really the main argument of the book is that we're told we live in a free market system, and actually we don't. So particularly in the 1980s, you had Margaret Thatcher in the UK, Ronald Reagan in the US, and their narrative was the government's gotten too big. We need to cut back on the state and create free functioning markets because if you create free enterprise and competition, that is what is ultimately going to make everyone better off. It's going to boost living standards, etc. Now, that was the narrative. The reality has been very, very different because we haven't seen free markets. We've actually seen the emergence of very large and powerful monopolies and oligopolies that have dominated their markets, that have pushed up prices for consumers, that have often been involved in, big scandals. One of the examples I use in the book is actually Boeing. So the Boeing 737 MAX disasters took place in the context of this extremely greedy, almost corrupt corporate culture where engineering expertise was denigrated. And the whole idea was just slash costs, produce these planes as cheaply and as possible. And also, when anything goes wrong, just get subsidies and tax breaks from the government and lobby the government really, really hard for contracts, for preferential treatment, basically. And this example really shows, we don't live in a free market. Boeing has a huge amount of market power. It has very close links with the government, which means that, it's able to kind of extract taxpayers' money out of government institutions. And that's really, I think, it exposes the lie, the free market lie, which is, we have monopolies instead of competition. And we have governments which are actually supporting those monopolies rather than regulating them. And governments that are actually kind of redistributing money up, the other way. It's working people who get taxed. And it's the big businesses and the wealthy that are avoiding their taxes and then getting subsidies, getting tax breaks, getting regulatory perks because they have this power to kind of lobby and really kind of influence what goes on within government. So I kind of contrast what we're told with how the system actually works. We're told we live in a free market democracy, and actually it's more like monopoly and oligarchy. It's a small number of people that get to really have a huge amount of influence over what kind of businesses that we have, and what kind of environmental impact we have, and what products we have on the shelves, and what jobs we have, and all these sorts of things. And yeah, I think that lie that free markets exist and are going to make everyone better off is really toxic, because it allows people to say that capitalism means freedom, and if you have anything other than the kind of system that we have now, then you're going to have to sacrifice your freedom. Actually, that's not true, because the power of those at the top within this system right now is already constraining people's freedom. And it's also causing a whole load of other problems. And there's a kind of broader and deeper and more human understanding of what it means to be free, which is, yes, I have responsibility for my actions and nobody's standing in my way, but also I have responsibility for society and society has responsibility for me. And we can work together to decide how that system works.
And that's what we kind of saw when you gave the example of Jackson, Mississippi, correct? Is
Yeah,
that community
absolutely.
coming together. So you talk about like alternate markets, peering behind the curtain to what lies beyond capitalism, and I assume that you're referencing freedom there, that there's alternate economies and social order. How can we look at the micro of Jackson, Mississippi, and how they collectively got together on a micro level as a community and how they flourish together, and how can we as a collective organize, how can the collective organize itself, right? That
Mm.
on a macro level, what can we learn from Jackson, Mississippi?
Loads, I think. And the organization there is really interesting. I'd really encourage people to look it up. It's called Cooperation Jackson. And the philosophy is really about building cooperative businesses and, yeah, creating these kind of community and social enterprises to support people through difficult times and to make their community more prosperous. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. Firstly, it's that, it is possible to change things now. I think a lot of people think, oh, well, the system's really unfair. So the only thing we can do is try and vote once every 4 years and then hope that things get better. And they get, disillusioned and upset and annoyed when that doesn't happen. I think the thing that Corporation Jackson shows us is that we can start to really build change today. We can organize and cooperate with the people around us, with our co-workers, with other people in our community to do things differently. And the biggest thing that's standing in the way of that isn't any big, it's not the law, it's not any big kind of constraints that would prevent us from doing community organizing. It's just the fact that nobody really thinks about it. Nobody imagines that that's something that they can do. If you live in a community where, I don't know, your local library is about to close down, or there's a big firm that's just moved in and it's creating kind of havoc with the local environment or with the water supply or something. Like, a lot of people just think, oh, well, this is unfair, but there's not anything I can do about it. Or they think, oh, I'll just write to my representative. Whereas actually, the examples that I lay out in the book show that you can start bringing people together, meeting with each other and saying, how do we fight back against this now? How do we fight to keep this local library open? How do we, protest outside of this big factory that's harming our community, say? There's so many examples of that happening. And I think, that is quite an American thing in a certain way, to like have a community that bands together to protect each other. So there is that tradition in the US of people doing that. I think it's just been lost as we've moved to this really individualistic and competitive way of doing things.
What
Exactly.
I was just thinking, what sort of for anyone listening, what sort of personal things? How would they get started? On organizing something
Yeah,
like
so
that?
I think, there's so many different ways that you can do this. I like to say we need to organize in our communities, in our workplaces, and on the streets. And really, it's about picking whatever way works best for you. So just to take community organizing to start with, you might, for example, volunteer with my local food bank. And that's a very small thing to do, but it allows me to kind of come into contact with other people in my local area and say, what are the issues that are going on here and how can we kind of push back against them? So there's kind of volunteering and that sort of thing that you can do to kind of get your foot in the door. Then there are the kind of more political things that you can look at in terms of what are the local political organizations that exist in your area. Whether that's, I know that the system is different in the US than it is in the UK, but you have kind of local and metropolitan levels of government that people can get involved in and can, organize in and around, just as we have local government in the UK as well. And that's something that people do get involved in. And then there are often, you just really have to kind of get engaged with what's going on and find out what people are doing in your local community. So like, one of the great things I love doing here where I live, which is in Cornwall, is volunteering with the groups that are supporting beach cleanups and fighting back against the pollution of our waterways and things, because there's a big surfing community here, and I'm personally a big surfer as well. So it's kind of connecting my interests and my community, and using that as a springboard to get more involved. And then when we're talking about our workplaces, getting involved in a union might be really helpful for you, depending on what sector you're in. So there's lots more union organizing I know going on across the US in Amazon and Starbucks and all these different places where people are saying, we want wages in line with inflation and lots of other improvements in their benefits and stuff. That can be really empowering for people, if they feel like, there's this unequal relationship within their company. So getting involved in a union is, I think, a really great start. And then, of course, there's all these kind of big social movements that you can get involved in. So, that might look like getting involved in the climate movement and turning up to a protest against, the oil companies or something. It might look like getting involved in your, movement against poverty, and supporting people in your local community that way. It might look like getting involved in big P politics, although that's something often people don't want to go into immediately. So I think
I'm
there's so many different
mhm,
options, and it
mhm.
just really depends on who you are as a person, what your interests are, what your community looks like. It just takes a little bit of exploring, I think.
I'm so
What do
happy
you think
you
they?
just
Oh,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
Dr. Simon, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what do you think happened in Jackson that they actually were able to get so many people involved? Because even though those are great ideas, it's just getting people to change from being selfish to selfless, making that
Hmm.
switch. What do you think they did that we could encourage other people to do so they could be more selfless?
One of the big things that helped in Jackson was the fact that this was a movement that developed out of the civil rights movement. So it was really powerful in the Black community. And that, I think, already has quite strong community links. There are strong community institutions that encouraged people to get involved. Now, that is, I think, something that is strong within the Black community in the US, but it's not the only place that you see that. You guys have very strong religious communities, all sorts of kind of community institutions that do put people from very different walks of life into the same room. Now, most of the time, they aren't used in progressive ways. It's just, you show up to church and you get the sermon and whatever. But there are loads of really good examples of, like, I'm just using religious organizations now because it's on the top of my head, but of community churches going out and helping to fight poverty or pushing for progressive legislation and that sort of thing. So I think it's about linking up with existing sources of what we would call social capital, basically, the areas where people already have these links that allow them to kind of network and build on. And from there, it's about talking to people. if that's kind of what I'm doing now, I guess, but it's also what I do a
Mhm.
lot with just people in my community and my friends and stuff. You're having a conversation with someone and they'll say, I feel lonely, I feel angry about politics, I feel powerless. And if you're in that conversation, you can say, well, why don't you do something about it? Not in a judgmental way, but in a look at all these options there are that would allow you to get involved in your community, to feel a sense of power, of connection, of joy, of all these amazing things that comes from getting together with others to achieve things. And I
Hmm.
think it's just putting that idea in people's minds.
I'm
Mhm.
so thankful that you mentioned cleaning up the beaches. If you see or come across a plastic in the water or anything, pick it up. I mean, I do that too because I just have this personal belief that I'm an ancestor of tomorrow, and this element here on Earth was here before I got here, and it will be here after I leave. And it's a sense of responsibility for future generations. Also, it has made me realize, yes, I am a small, tiny, tiny pebble here, but I have a ripple effect whether people see me pick this up or not. It doesn't matter. I'm doing something that's right, because I see in a lot of Western um, cultural influences, there's a lot of pollution in our water and in
Mm.
our land. When you look at indigenous tribes and indigenous peoples, they had a more sense of a connectiveness to the earth that they walked on and lived on. They had a more sense of respect for nature around them too. You do mention um, if you think more money equals more power, then you see change as being impossible. How do we remove the power we associate with capital? How do we devalue capital so we can see change as being possible?
That's such a huge question. And I think it cuts to the core of so much that's wrong with our society at the moment. And it cuts to the core of a lot of the kind of really reactionary political movements that exist right now. And I'm thinking particularly about, the kind of Andrew Tates of this world and the online influencers who are telling young men and young boys, your value is basically tied to, can you buy this expensive car? Can you surround yourselves with these, nice looking women? And it's this idea of masculinity, but also your identity as a person, your worth as a person is tied to what you can consume, to what you can earn. And the fact that most people will never achieve that makes them feel worthless and angry, right? And that's often what people like Tate, for example, are pushing back against. They're saying, oh, the reason that you can't afford a Maserati is because of feminism or because of immigration or whatever. And actually, it's just because not everyone can have a Maserati. And the reason that some people really want a Ferrari or an expensive car is to show their dominance over other people. It's to say, I have more money than you. You will never be as good as me. And it feeds into this like competitive, like individualistic, status driven view of society, which is, it's fine for the people at the top. I think it's toxic even for the people at the top because it really kind of undermines, I think, what it means to be a human being if you just see your identity as tied to the things that you can consume. So I don't think it's good for them either. But for the people at the bottom who aren't able to achieve those things, it makes them really angry. And you see this particularly with young men in the US and the UK who are like, I can't afford a home. I can't, afford these things that I'm told that I need to be valuable. So I'm rebelling against the whole system. I kind of want to just, burn it all down or like, just really just react against everything. And often that leads to violence. It leads to really severe mental health problems when people think, oh, I'm worthless basically because I can't achieve these things. And to get rid of that, we have to rethink what we value because we can't just say the more money you have, the more worth you have as a person, or the better your career, the more worth you have as a person, because it's not true, firstly. Secondly, because, even people who maybe do deserve lots of wealth and good jobs because they're intelligent and hardworking. They don't get the opportunity to actually do that because they're just struggling to survive, but also because it makes us sick just struggling against each other to beat each other, to win, to be better, to be at the top, to be richer, to be more powerful. And that's where I think as well we can, as you were saying, learn a lot from different kinds of cultures, not just, around the world, but also throughout history, who have known the value and the importance care, of care for one another and of care for the environment. Now, obviously, there's always going to be competition and people want status and people want to say, this is me, I'm different from everyone else. But you should be able to do that through your skills, through your networks, through the things that make you unique as a person, through the ways you're able to contribute to society and to your community. Like, why do we spend so much more time valuing, finance bros than we do nurses? In a just society, we would say that work of care is so, so valuable and so important, and it should be treated as such. So those are really about changing the kind of values that we have as a society, changing the way we think about each other and our relationship to nature as well. So saying, we have to care for each other,
Yes.
but we also have to care for the planet.
We do, and it's really, you mentioned and a very great point. A lot of men are influenced by Andrew Tate, who's the epitome of toxicity on every level in masculinity. But you're also challenging it by saying, you know, like there's this tribal instinct that we have innately of we're part of this community or we're part of this tribe. But you're saying step outside your comfort zone because when you feel like you're uncomfortable in a new environment, learning from other cultures, going to different countries, that's how you know you're growing. But if you have this innate instinct of I want to do more, like you're speaking about the people who are like you mentioned. Um, and I'm upset about that I can't, influence or change this country, this community, this town that I live in to do better. Step outside your comfort zone. Find your new tribe. Find and surround yourself with people, who are not finance bros, but nurses, right? And you will find like-minded individuals and you will learn to care about nature and our environment. I feel like you're so spot on about everything, and it's about caring about our environment equates to caring about ourselves because we are made up of nature. Our human
Mm.
body is found in nature too, a lot of the elements. So it's very interesting. It's very unique what you mentioned. You do quote, "We're accepting you're allowed to feel like you're free." But you're only allowed really so much acceptance and freedom. And you're touching upon the phenomenon of being unfree. So it's like yes. Please explain that.
Yeah, so I think this idea of unfreedom is really important because, you can say we have this dichotomy of like freedom and and not freedom and being trapped basically or being, constrained. So if you're free, there's nobody in your way. You can do whatever you want. There's nobody stopping you from doing something. There's nobody telling you what to do or saying, I'm going to throw you in jail if you don't do this. And if you are unfree, then it means you are being directed, controlled, physically prevented from doing something. Now, this idea of unfreedom, it kind of sits between these ideas of free and not free, because there are lots of ways in which you can be without constraint. You can be, like able to choose amongst a number of different options for your life. You're not going to be thrown in jail or, beaten up for choosing those options. And that freedom is very important. It's an important part of political democracy. But you can still be unfree in the sense of being constrained and limited because of the nature and the structure of society. So, if you are born into a very poor household, maybe, your parents do not have enough money to provide you with, like a good education, to provide you with good food, good meals, to give you the opportunities that you want. Maybe you end up in an environment that pushes you towards crime or all these sorts of things, you are not as free as someone who is raised in a big house in the suburbs and whose parents can pay for them to do anything, and they have all these opportunities and freedoms to kind of change their life. In a lot of ways, in the first example, you are constrained. Why are you constrained? Because you have to survive. And if your life is constantly oriented around just basically kind of like eking out the most barest minimum level of survival, earning minimum wage, like just trying to keep a roof over your head, trying to keep your head above water, then you are not free in the same way as someone who has all these other expansive opportunities. Now, the interesting thing is that on top of that, there are also all these mechanisms that are used to kind of try and keep people down from the top, which aren't necessarily like, constraints, but they are real pressures. Um, so, in the UK, for example, we have free healthcare, and we have kind of, free education and lots of public services that were introduced after the Second World War, because the labor movement basically really fought to make those rights a reality. What we've seen over the last kind of 20, 30, 40 years has been governments just chipping away at those kind of forms of social security, making them more expensive or making them harder to access or making them less effective. And in doing so, they are in a very real way limiting people's freedom. Because if you, as you are in the US, say, have your healthcare is tied to your employment, it's very hard for you to then leave your job or find another job. Or, if you lose your job, you're in this position of, right, okay, how do I afford healthcare? So your freedom is tied to what happens in employment, right? It's the same thing with, education. Education is in some ways the source of a lot of freedom. It allows you to make real informed decisions. It allows you to understand the world. But often that is limited based on what you can and can't afford. So there are all these ways in which society is structured to tell us that we're free because there are no constraints in front of us. Whether you're the richest person or the poorest person, the government isn't going to tell you what to do. And yet, because of the way that society is built, because of the privileges that are afforded to the wealthiest and the most powerful, and the way in which the poorest are often kind of punished and pushed down, that freedom is really much more limited than we think. And I think that causes a lot of anger, because, from what we've been saying, we're all told you're free to do what you want, go pursue the American dream. And then when you can't achieve that because of all these barriers in your way, you think, oh, I'm not good enough. This is my fault. I'm the one to blame. And that causes people mental ill health, but also it causes them to rebel against the whole system.
Grace Blakeley, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter, X, at Grace Blakeley, and on Instagram and TikTok at Grace Blakeley.
And your book is available on, I'm assuming, all platforms
It
like
is. You can
Amazon.
get
And
Vulture Capitalism in hardback, but also on audiobook and Kindle.
thank you so much, Grace Blakeley. And what is a lasting impression that you want to leave um, audiences?
Um, I guess I want people listening to this to really think about the actions they can take now to build the kind of world that they want to live in. And not just as an individual. I'm not just talking about, changing where you shop or that type of thing. I'm talking about how you can start talking to those around you and start building movements, building connections, building bridges to try and create the kind of cooperative and collective world that we're going to need if we're going to want to solve any of the problems that we have.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank
Thank
you.
you
much.
for joining us. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much.